My talk will be about plant health, and we worked on this topic, especially with a strong focus on imidacloprid, one of our key insecticides, since around about 2005, when we realized that this active ingredient has something more to offer than just being an insecticide. So we used the science we generated over the last years to defend this molecule, especially against also generic pressure. And so I will go to explain you at least these three topics in more detail. They will be partly a bit a torture because I have to dive deep into some of your physiological and biochemical understanding, but I will keep it as simple as possible. So if you have specific questions which need to be clarified later on, so don't feel uncomfortable, so simply ask later on. So first of all, I'm going to address what is plant health from a plant physiological point of view. And we are then going to define what are abiotic and biotic stresses. This is the second point. And finally, most of my time I will spend to explain to you the effects of imidacloprid and the two azoles, tebuconazole and prothioconazole, how they work in plants and produce these plant health effects. So first of all, my understanding from plant health, and that's also the understanding of my company, is plant health is to be understood as a balanced cell physiological status, allowing optimal growth through efficient use of the key requirements of any crop. That is radiation, or if you want to have it more simpler, that's sunlight, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and water and nutrients. And that's it. Everything else can be derived from this. If you want to define this much more simpler, we can also say a plant is on balance if it is stress-free. So if we start with the definition on stress, how can we categorize the stresses? We first of all have the abiotic stress factors, and there are numerous stress factors, and simply spoken, they are more or less physical effects which interfere with the yield potential of any crop. And to address some of the more relevant stresses, I would like to start with drought and waterlogging. So drought is self-explanatory, but waterlogging, for some people, they don't see it as a disadvantage. It is a clear disadvantage regarding the oxygen situation for a root. Roots need oxygen. They need structure in the soil, and if the soil pores are filled with water, we have anoxic conditions, and during these anoxic conditions, microbes start their anaerobial metabolism and generating lots of toxic gases and compounds. So H2S, for instance, or CH4 are one of these compounds which damage roots. So sunlight is something also self-explanatory. We cannot manage sunlight. It is there, and especially during summer times, crops are exposed to extremely high radiation amounts, so in terms of photons which have to be processed by the chlorophyll. Gases in some areas where I'm coming from, industrial areas, we produce a lot of SO2 through the burning of oil or coal or gases, and SO2 in mixture with rain will produce acid rain and interfere with cuticulars in a way that they dissolve the cuticulars, make the plants more vulnerable to attacks from fungi, for instance. Besides SO2, we have ozone as a major problem in some European countries, which interfere with the gas exchange of the crops. So O3, which is ozone, is very reactive, and once it is taken up through the stomates, it will interfere with the cells and damage partly the cell walls and the membranes. So heat, also relatively easy to understand. Each crop has a limit which it can stand in terms of heat degrees. So wheat around 30 to 35 degrees can still produce a decent yield, but beyond that, yield is really getting out of production more or less because there's an overflow of photons which cannot be processed. And apart from that, the temperature itself causes some problems with the proteins in each cell, so folding, unfolding processes, which is a consequence of the interaction between genes and the actions via proteins. It's quite important that these folding, unfolding processes still work in a proper way. Soil type, just to mention for those who are not in the know regarding the effect from soils, soil types vary regarding their consistency, their texture, their deepness. So we have very fertile soils like Chernozems or para-brown soils, which have the ability to really contain lots of water, rainwater, and slowly release it to the plant. Whereas other soils like pot soils, for instance, which have a huge amount of sandy particles, they are unable really to store water over a long term. So if you don't get regular rain events or irrigation, then in these soils the production is much lower than in a para-brown or in a Chernozem soil, which are able to contain water for longer and higher amounts. So nutrients also can be available in excess or can be below the level the plant would need. So that in itself causes stresses in terms of osmotic stresses to the rooting environment, or the inability of plants to deal with growth if there are no nitrogen, sodium, potassium, or whatever available for building up the crop yield in the end. Dust, usually in the household a problem, but also in the field. Dust can cover leaves, and so especially during summer times when there are no rain events, this will reduce the photosynthesis quite dramatically and also interfere with the efficacy of some pesticides. So dust is absorption material, so to say, not only for photons from sunlight, but also for compounds which are applied folially. So we spoke about soil, maybe one aspect in soil which needs to be addressed, that is the pH. We know that under certain pHs, so below 2.5, toxic aluminium will be set free and prevent root growth. So keeping the soil pH in balance between 0.5 to 7.5 or so, 5.5 to 7.5 is a management objective. Mechanical stress, I skipped ag chems here, so we need to talk about ag chems, agricultural chemicals. If you apply products over the field and especially at the margins, you sometimes have a double application, so especially with herbicide that can be a problem and cause phytotoxicity. On top of that, cold and frost is a critical issue, especially with winter wheat or even with early sown spring wheat or corn. So it will slow down the physiology of a crop or even damages if it comes to the building of crystals, water crystals in the cells. So plants can actually be killed. Mechanical stress, so I would like to cite one of my experiences on my own in the lab when we transported plants from one lab to the other to measure the photosynthesis, and we realized that the transportation from the ear to the root, for instance, is disturbed. So the assimilation transport can be really disrupted by strong winds. So we cannot influence that under field conditions, but just to be aware that even wind has an impact on the performance of your crop. So abiotic stress factors, to summarize this, difficult to mention, lack of knowledge, when, how much, and how to manage it. And on top of the abiotic stress factors, we have the biotic stress factors, which are much better to manage because all these problems can be more or less controlled with products, fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, and so on. Even bacteria can be controlled to a certain extent with some products, and viruses can be reduced, at least in the distribution, by vector control. So the main effects coming from all these stress factors is a reduction of the yield potential which is part of the genetics you buy, so the variety has a certain yield potential. And these are the comrades which trying to get the yield down. So I would like also address another stress factor, that is the decision-making process. If we as advisors decide too late or too early, or recommend something which doesn't really address the need of your crop, we have here a management issue. So management can cause stress as well due to our failures in the decision-making process based on lack of information or lack of knowledge. Stress really matters, and this becomes clear when we look at data published by the American Society of Plant Physiologists in 2000. What we see here is a comparison between the record yield marked in blue compared to the green average yield for these arable crops here. These data have been generated in the northwest of the US. And what we see further is that the major yield losses can be attributed to abiotic stresses here in red, so up to 70 or even more percentage can be lost in yield due to abiotic stress losses. The amount of biotic stress losses despite crop protection is relatively small, but still in some crops considerable due to, let's say, a lack of mode of actions in controlling resistant species or diseases, so that can really build up and still cause some stresses. So remember, stress really matters, and the major issue we are talking about today are primarily the abiotic stresses. This is also nicely shown by a publication from USDAR's Hydrology and Remote Sensing Laboratory. They looked into corn stress scenarios, so a wet year, mild drought and severe drought, and they compiled the yield corn grain bushels per acre and generated this nice regression curve showing that 15 days are sufficient to kill 50% of the corn yield under these stress conditions. So it's getting worse if we get under severe drought. It's getting better if there's a wet year, but overall there will be stress in every crop at some point in time, and 15 days, especially for corn in the areas where these tests have been done, build up a loss of 50%. So now this is the first torture slide, relatively simply explaining the basics of what happens in a plant cell under stress. So what you see here is a simplified plant cell which contains some major components like the cell nucleus, the plastids, the chloroplasts, and the mitochondrium. And so if you remember your studies at university, you know that sunlight energy will be transformed in the chloroplast into chemical energy. So the chemical which is produced is glucose, and this is further processed in a lot of different compounds. And finally, it is also one of these degradation products is also needed to produce then ATP in the end, which is generated in a very complicated production process in the mitochondria. The point we need to see at this situation is that for the production of the major fuel for growing crops, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is that for this synthesis we need NAD, nicotine adenine dinucleotide. So, and if this is short, then this process will only be done in a marginal way, or it can stop totally if the NAD pool is depleted. Why I'm talking about NAD? Because NAD is also necessary for fueling the repair mechanism in a plant cell. So if you remember a drought stress event, this process of producing glucose is no longer possible. Which means that the sunlight photons can no longer be transferred into chemical energy. So there are photons which causing problems. They are damaging. They are creating also reactive oxygen species in the process of having no longer water available, which is necessary for providing hydrogen and oxygen for all these processes in the chloroplast. So the photons is energy which are causing the damages, and as soon as damages occur in especially the cell kernel or the cell nucleus, these reactive oxygen species, which can be identified with these star-like pieces or like these star-like formations, so they damage the software of the nucleus, so the DNA, and this software is in principle the tool to to process everything in the plant. So if these processes are disturbed, damages will be set. And so NAD is necessary to keep the repair mechanisms based on some enzyme systems necessary or available. And PARP, for instance, and PARG are the main repairing mechanisms in a plant cell to reconstruct the DNA or to repair, let's say, the membranes and so on. So summarizing this, if these enzyme systems are depleting NAD, there is no longer ATP production possible because ATP production depends on the NAD pool. So to cut a long story short, this is summarized on that slide. We have, again here, the stresses, abiotic stress and biotic stresses. They lower the assimilate availability. So glucose is an assimilate, and so if you further reduce then the assimilation potential, you end up with excessive energy losses, which are caused by reactive oxygen species due to the sunlight, the excessive sunlight photons and so on, causing these damages. So summarizing this in essence, acetate, we can say that stress impairs the energy balance of a crop. And so more energy goes for repair. This is the must for the plant. So they have no regulation what to do first, producing energy or producing repair mechanism. They go always for repair. And if you are lucky, you get the water you need to start growth again. If you are unlucky, the plant will die and you will lose your total yield.